It's now my very great pleasure to move into the conversation. And many of you who are Geneva-based will of course know Michael Møller for his work as head of the UN organisation here in Geneva, but who is dear to many of our hearts, in fact more because of his work with the Gender Champions. Elizabeth Broderick is someone who's been known to me as an Australian and from Foreign Affairs for some time, for being an absolute champion, and I use the word not at all lightly, for the sorts of issues that we're talking about today. She's currently the chair rapporteur of the UN Working Group on Discrimination Against Women and Girls, but she has really driven gender equality in workplaces throughout Australia as the founder and the convener of the Male Champions of Change initiative. And she was also a member of the steering group for Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade's Women in Leadership strategy. And in her various roles, Elizabeth has worked really closely with big business as well as government, and has seen up close the sorts of challenges that leaders have in making these changes, and the sorts of fears and concerns within organisations. Michael Møller, as I mentioned, has really been power behind International Gender Champions alumni for some time now, given he co-founded the network back in 2015. Then leadership as the DG of UNOG included, really importantly, UNOG's first policy for gender equality and empowerment of women that was used to combat discrimination and improve gender parity, and also launched a campaign on workplace sexual harassment. And again, I think those foundation approaches have had great resonance for us here in Geneva. Michael knows the UN system very well indeed, having begun with UNHCR some, dare I say it, Michael, 40 years ago, and so knows the sorts of challenges in the field as well as in headquarters, and so was really uniquely placed, I think, to drive those changes in Geneva. So moving into the conversation, I have a couple of questions for each of our panellists today, and I'm going to start with you, Liz. So you founded the Male Champions of Change, which is a network of leaders across the private and the public sector who are really genuinely committed to gender equality, although some of them may have found it more hard work than they expected when they signed up and found that you were on the case. And the idea was to engage men in a leadership role in this regard. So Liz, can you tell us what inspired the initiative and why gender equality and inclusion are so important for business and organisations? Over to you.
Thanks very much, Sally. And can I just say how delighted I am to be here and part of a conversation. I've heard a lot about the Gender Champions. I first started connecting with you even pre bringing the group together. So it's just so wonderful to see how far it's come. All the over 1,000 different strategies in those 5 years, and just to see some of the Gender Champions on the call. So it's a great privilege to be here and to speak with Michael as well, and also to be back with Sally. We're kind of DFAT mates, so it's good to be here. So the Male Champions of Change, we started about 2010, so we've probably got about 5 years ahead of you in just the experimenting. At that point, we were really experimenting. And the reason we started with men was that at that time I was Australia's Sex Discrimination Commissioner. And I kind of had in my mind that if we were going to accelerate gender equality in Australia, I would just come in, I would work with all the other great women around Australia, and we would continue the collective action of women, because that's what's delivered most women most rights across the world. And indeed, that's just been so very important. But after a couple of years, I came to understand that if we wanted to accelerate change, we needed to work with those who held power in our organisations, power in our nation. And indeed, that clearly was men. So I started to understand that gender equality is about the redistribution of power, either in the family, in organisations, or in states. And if I wanted to do that, I'd need to encourage powerful men to come on board. not just to discuss, but really to learn about the complexity of gender equality and also step up and take strong action. So that's when I picked up the phone and I rang the 6 most powerful men in Australia. And I made a plea. I said, will you use your power and influence, your collective voice and wisdom to create change for women in this country? And I started to talk to them about the data, which showed, you know, about the absence of women in parliament, the absence of women in our big companies. But I quickly came to understand that I could put all the data I wanted in front of them. I really needed to engage their hearts as well as their heads. And so I still remember my conversation with the first male champion. He was the CEO of IBM in our region. And we talked about the data, and then I found out that he had twins, a boy and a girl. And I helped him see that without intervention by powerful, decent men like him, his daughter would never have the same opportunities as her twin brother, all because she was a girl. So we really went on from that. And we started to bring together more and more men. It was a bit like running group therapy for the first few sessions. I have to say, everyone had their hands in their head saying, this is so hard, we've tried everything, nothing's working. But once we came out of our group therapy stage, we got on a bit of a roll. And we held to a few simple disciplines, and that is, we decided that we had to listen deeply to the voices of women. We had to learn, and then we had to step up in partnership with women and lead. So this was not about a reinforcement of a patriarchy. It wasn't about men trying to save or rescue women. This was about being equal partners in change, taking equal accountability and responsibility for that change. So we've now evolved to a situation where we have 17 separate groups of male champions of change, because we found that groups 20 or less are groups where we can have intimate and trusting conversations, because this is tough work. It goes to the heart of who we are and how we live. The time for talking's over. We want to take strong action together, but we want an environment which is psychologically safe. So where no question is too dumb, no one is vilified for, you know, trying something which then fails. It has to be a safe place for men to learn about the complexity of gender equality. And it also has a touch of competitive spirit, which has been fantastic, as we've found over the last 10 years. Someone comes in to say they've just, their parental leave scheme's been lifted to 20 weeks. The person beside them says, 20 weeks, we're at 24. Well, we're at 26, we're now at 28. So I have to say, I love that competitive dimension. It wasn't in the initial design, but it's playing out quite well. But the things that were in the initial design is that this is a CEO-led strategy. It's about CEOs, it's about decisions and influence and power that CEOs or leaders of organization have. And when I talk about leaders like yours, ours incorporates, you know, the chief of a defense force, the head of Qantas, the head of government organizations, the head of our policing organizations, intelligence. I mean, we're bringing in the most powerful men, and indeed now women as well, because women have come to the strategy as what we call special advisors. They are equal in every way to a male champion of change, but the accountability for change doesn't swap from the men to the women, because most women are doing their part. It stays squarely on the men, but it's informed by the voices of these very senior women. And Sally's talked about the head of our Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. She's a secretary there. She is one of the special advisors into the male champions of change. So we meet 4 times a year. During COVID, we've been meeting every 6 to 8 weeks. Each of those 17 groups will come together on a Google Hangout or Zoom or whatever it is, because we've worked out that during COVID, what we have is really an infrastructure for sharing. And there's nothing more important than an infrastructure for sharing during COVID, where the answers are unknowable, and we're working together. So we 4 times a year, we expect attendance at the meetings. We have 75% attend, or every champion will attend at least 75% of the meetings. We're well resourced. Every male champion change will make a financial contribution, which will fund a very well resourced secretariat. And that's absolutely critical, because we're about a strong work plan and action plan. We're not about talking although of course sharing of what we're learning is absolutely at the heart of a strategy, but so is strong action. We set the meetings at least a year in advance. We report our gender data every year, and we go all in on quite a number of strategies. So if you want to come in as a male champion, you need to go all in on some of the strategies that you've got there as well. So the panel pledge, all roles flex. So that is flexibility. And what the pandemic has shown us is that technology wasn't the problem in the past. It was inertia and habit that was stopping us from actually allowing anyone to work from anywhere at any time. So indeed, we've once and for all, we know that work is not somewhere you go. It's what you do. And so we've really stepped up on that. The more recently, we've stepped up on eliminating everyday sexism. So you have to go all in on that. You have to go all in on our anti-sexual harassment strategies. And you have to go all in on domestic violence as a workplace issue. Now, we've only started to move into that in the last, say, 3 years. We've recognized that violence is on a continuum. No harm at home, no harm at work. So it's a single continuum. What affects employees affects employers. And not only that, during COVID, your house becomes our workplace. So any violence that's happening in your house is absolutely part of now a strong connection to work. So you have to go all in on an organisational response to domestic violence as a workplace issue. And just next week, we'll launch our joint resource with all the male champions of change, which will look at an organisational response to perpetrators of domestic violence, individuals who are using our computers, our telephones, our workplace, our telecommunications infrastructure to control their intimate partners or use it in some way which is abusive towards their families. So I just finish by saying, as I said, we now have over 260 male champions of change. The groups in Australia cover 10% of Australia's workforce. So once we get that level of coverage, we can really start to shift how work is done. They're leaders or CEOs from not just Australian organisations, but international, transnational companies, government departments, universities, police, the military, different leaders. Some of them are sector specific, others are national groups. And we've also got groups in the Philippines, in Pakistan, we're starting one in Vietnam and India. We've got the Global Tech Group, which is out of New York, London and Europe, and that's the CEOs of big global tech companies. And we basically, every one of them will be experimenting with hundreds of different strategies. They will implement the strategy and then they will offer that strategy up together with the learnings to the whole coalition or collective of male champions to shamelessly rip off and implement in their own organisation. So that's kind of it in a snapshot. Very happy to talk further about it later on.
Fantastic. Thank you very much indeed, Liz. I think that really gives us a sort of a sense of the energy and that, you know, going to the heart of who can actually make change. And I think that speaks again to this group as well. So Michael, turning to you, as the person who introduced UNOG's first ever policy for gender equality and empowerment of women back in 2016, what sparked your interest in doing that, and how you led UNOG through that, and perhaps, you know, what was their resistance, and what were some of the sort of critical points as you took that work forward? Really interested to hear how you made that happen.
Thank you, Sally, and thank you very much, Liz, for your expose. Before I get into mine, and before I forget, my point about that is, if I may encourage our colleagues in the Secretariat of the International Gender Champions to be in touch with you, because clearly there's a number of lessons that are replicable in whatever it is the Gender Champions are trying to do in its different hubs, and no reason to reinvent wheels that you guys have already invented. So I thought that a lot of what you said certainly resonated with what we've been trying to do and with the objectives that we set out. at the very beginning of this gender champion adventure. But it sounds to me like there may be some really good synergies that one can build on and learn from. So this is a call to Fleur, who's somewhere on our call today, to maybe follow up on that later on. Now, the gender policy I have to start with the beginning of the gender champions and how it was created. It was a conversation. Well, first of all, it was at a time when, as they do yearly, the WEF had come up with some statistics that said that if we continued with business as usual, we would reach gender parity in about 273 years, or some ridiculous number like that. And which really stuck with me. And just about the same time, I was having a conversation with Pamela Hamamoto, the then American ambassador in Geneva, who has also been working a lot and was already then doing other stuff on gender. And we talked about it, and we decided that, you know, basically we need to do something about it. But we needed to do something that was easy to understand, easy to implement, and easy to measure. And then certainly also put in place a number of measures that would sustain this. And then Kate Bookman, who is a founder and organization, an NGO called Women at the Table, joined in this effort, and the three of us were kind of the founders of the Gender Champions. One of the things we decided that whoever became a gender champion had to make 3 commitments. The first commitment was one that we all shared, which is that we would never again participate in discussions, meetings, panels, whatever, where both genders were not present. That in itself was an interesting initiative, because it moved very quickly and had quite a success, much more than I thought it would. And within a year, there were practically no meetings at all at the UN that did not have both genders present. But I'll come back to what you need to do as a leader to actually make that happen, because you do have to be a little bit in the face of people and be robust, and you have to put in place also a set of consequences that happen if people don't do what they're supposed to be doing. But anyway, so we had a commitment, and then each of us had commitments that were specific to our workplace. And by then, talking to my colleagues, that for some reason, we did not have a policy on gender. So that was my first commitment, to create one. And I was lucky to have a number of really fantastic colleagues who immediately went to work on this. And in very short order, in a few months, we came up, with the help also of UN Women and other experts, came up with a policy that I think holds water and has now been copied in many places around the UN system. Important to make sure that we gave almost a legal framework for whatever we were going to do. Something that everybody could write. We are working, or we were working in a bureaucracy, and people love rules, and you need to have a structure through which you can push these changes. With the policy in itself is not going to do it, but the policy, together with we installed a number of structures throughout the organization. We designated gender representatives in each department, both male and female. We had workshops. We had very important aspect of all this was to listen to the staff and to bring them into the conversation and ask them for their advice as well, and to make sure that they became operational part of the effort. Again, with some really inspiring colleagues, one of whom is here, Corinne Momal, who was very much in the lead on this at the time, and still is. We moved quite quickly to create a network of staff that were not just appointed in name, but took it seriously and were very operational in fostering the conversations in their departments and in their offices, bring back feedback, enrich also the way that we implemented the policy. So that was the first decision, sort of operational decision, to make sure that this was sustained and that the conversations move forward. Part of my other two commitments was to include gender in all the training that we're doing, and particularly in induction training of new staff coming in, to make sure that they understood what this policy was about and how it's going to be implemented, how it would affect them, how this would change our recruitment policies, how it would change our evaluation policies, and all of the aspects of the daily life of a colleague would be impacted by this policy. So this moved on, and I think the combination of a sort of fairly robust implementation of the policy within the organization, and with the increasingly the sort of build-up of the network of champions in a lot of the permanent missions, where they saw there was we were walking our talk inside the organization, and were giving inspiration also to what could be done in each workplace where a champion had accepted to be part of it. But after a while, we also realized that, you cannot implement in a vacuum. It has to be situated in the overall management of the whole organization. And there are a whole series of other things that happened there. And particularly the first step was to realize, and then to do something about the fact that we needed to look a little bit deeper. We needed to go deeper. We needed to look at hidden biases. We needed to look at habits. We needed to look at and do something about it. We needed to certainly look at the issue of sexism. So we took a whole series of initiatives that kind of chained together, also helped move the issue forward. We launched a Say No to Sexism campaign throughout the organization. That was an interesting experience, certainly at the beginning. This happened in the summer when the World Health Organization major meeting took place. About 5,000 delegates came in. So every single conference room, every single door, every single wall across the organization was plastered in posters about Say No to Sexism. On the first day, a lot of them were torn down by either staff or delegates, etc. We put them back up again. And then I started implementing this policy again in a somewhat robust way, because we had to show that we meant business. I have to just make a parenthesis here. This was not just about sexism among staff. This was also, in fact, in many cases, a bigger problem about the way that delegates were treating our younger female staff in conference rooms, etc. And we needed to deal with that as well. So one example that was not particularly pleasant, but which gave me an opportunity to really make a point, was when it was reported to me that a delegate from a particular country was sitting in a meeting with his back to the translator's booths, so they could see him watching porn on his phone during the meeting. And so I said, of course, clearly that was unacceptable. But what I did was to call out the ambassador, his ambassador, and say, look, this is totally unacceptable. I hope that you will take this person to task. And if it happens again, I will take away his pass and he will no longer be accepted into the building. And then sort of gently made it known that I had taken that action, and that had quite an impact. The interesting part of that was that it didn't take very long for this to be accepted. And in fact, not very long after, it was being copied in practically all the other organizations in town. So that became also, if you want, a movement. We did other things to address hidden biases. I remember being part of a really interesting day-long seminar we did with 50 senior male directors, moderated by a person who academic who has done a lot of work on that, and to have this conversation about hidden biases and the the trajectory of that conversation throughout the day was really interesting, from complete denial in the beginning from most of them, which was also sort of regionally biased, if you want, to a very serious conversation at the end, where most of them had realized that what they thought was their male perfection was maybe a little less perfect than we. And that helped also spark then throughout the organization. These were very senior men, other conversations on this issue. We had our theater group. We have a theater group in the UN. They wrote plays and played them for staff that were sort of 5-10 minute plays that showed situations of unacceptable sexist behavior between managers and staff, and so etc. You know, we really had to. I thought it was important to make it real to staff and to sort of make them understand. Now, all of this resulted also in a very quick change in numbers from some pretty abysmal levels of percentages of female staff, particularly as in most organizations in the higher levels. Within 2 years, we were very, very close to parity. It helped that at one point we had the arrival of our new Secretary General, Mr. Guterres, completely on board, and the gender of refugees became one in New York, the Secretary General, but who took the decision going to, with this right, impose parity. And in a year, a little over a year, all his undersecretary generals and assistant secretary generals were 50-50, and all the heads of resident coordinators and resident representatives in the field within a little bit longer time, but very quickly, were also 50-50. This was something that no Secretary General managed to do in the past 75 years. And this has also certainly changed the tenor of the conversation and the perception. It's really a perception change that just has to be hammered all the time. So there you are. I think the work continues. My successor is a woman, which is the first one in since UNOP started, which was a really good thing, and an excellent follow-up to those policies. Thank you.
Thank you both so much for those introductory comments. Those in and of themselves have given us an enormous amount of food for thought and critical things about really listening and learning from what you're hearing. But also, Michael, really important points that you've made about calling out bad behaviour and being quite deliberate in your approach and not taking no for an answer, just keeping going, knowing that this was a change that you had to lead and that there may be some resistance early on. But before we break out into the smaller groups, could I ask both of you very quickly, just to give a sense of what you think some of the tough questions are that we need to ask ourselves and our staff in order to take this agenda further? What are the difficult questions that we really, as individuals and as leaders of organisations, need to be prepared to ask? Liz, I'll give you the floor first, and if you could just give us a very quick burst.
So I think the number one tough question that it presents to me when I go in to look at culture of organisations, particularly around gender equality, respect and dignity, is there's a fear that men will lose, that in this gender equal world where we empower women, women have greater access to power. That means we're going to take power away from men. And what does it mean for me as a man working in the organisation? Does it mean I'm not going to be promoted as quickly? All those types of things. So I think that's one question. The other thing that I think is a tough question is, as a gender champion, or in Australia or elsewhere as a male champion of change, I think it's important to ask, how am I leading and what's my leadership shadow in relation to this? So the 4 questions that we ask when we're self-interrogating, because I believe human rights starts at home. We have to be the shift we're trying to make in the world. So we look at 4 dimensions. We say, how am I acting? So how I act, what I say, what I prioritize, and what I measure. On those 4 dimensions, am I leading in the way that I aspire to be leading? Because every one of us casts a shadow. We might say we care about gender equality, but we're scheduling the meetings at 8 a.m. when people have childcare responsibilities. Or as one CEO said to me the other day, he was out with his team, his executive team, and one of the men there started to tell a sexualized joke. Now, what happened at that point was that all the men laughed, the women laughed, and he said, so Liz, I laughed too. And then when he went out to get his feedback on his leadership shadow about how he was acting, these women who he went out to said, well, actually, you know what, you're really letting us down. And he said, well, why? And they said, well, when Steve, the unfunny joker, did what he always did, which was to start to tell the sexualized jokes, you laughed. And the CEO said, yeah, but I laughed because the men laughed and you women laughed, so I laughed as well. And the women told him very clearly, no, we laugh because Steve's our boss. And if we don't laugh, we don't fit in. And if we don't fit in, we don't have a career in this organization. But when you laughed, you let the organization down. You weren't the leader that you aspire to have. And you sent a really strong cultural message that Steve's behavior was okay. So I think we need to ask ourselves, what type of leader are we? We need to go out and interrogate and get some answers. And we've got a great tool which actually does that. And then we need to step up and act on the feedback that we're getting.
Great, thanks very much, Liz. And Michael, very quickly, what do you think some of the tough questions are that we do need to ask ourselves?
Well, I think that Liz just enumerated them. I would have brought up both, certainly the issue of being very aware and attuned to making sure that you find a balance between the way that in the way that you perceive how your male staff and women staff react to as you move forward on these policies. We had very clearly at some point feedback from particularly the younger male staff that they were beginning to get worried that their promotion prospects were kind of disappearing into the mist because of the policies that were put in place, and you have to deal with that clearly. I think that from the leadership point of view, it's incredibly important to be completely on the game. I mean, you cannot let down, and you cannot just begin to take things for granted because they're beginning to go well, because the numbers are going in the right direction, etc. I mean, one of the reasons why, for example, the first commitment I mentioned about not being part of meetings where both genders were not there, that was implemented in large part because both I and other very senior leaders in other organizations took it very seriously. I did not accept meetings where there were no female representatives. And if I walked into a room where I see there were only male, I simply walked out. And did not attend. I have been, at the very beginning when it was, we really had to make the point. When I received an invitation, one example I can give you, I received an invitation for a day-long set of different panel discussions. There was not a single woman in any of them, and I sent back a message to those who invited that I was not going to be there. First of all, unless they had a decent representation of women in the different panels. But on top of that, I would take away the meeting room in which that meeting was supposed to take place, unless they changed the participation. 4 hours later, I get a new list, and there were perfectly fine women in every single one of the panels. So it's not because there aren't women around, and we know that very well. It's just a matter of pushing hard. And so that policy really helped create a situation in which it was simply no longer possible to have meetings where both genders were not represented. And it went both ways. At some points, there were just only women on the dais, and I said that, you know, that's equally not acceptable. So I think it's constant follow-up. I think what Liz said about constantly asking yourself as a leader where you are, and checking back with your staff, checking back with your environment, checking back with your peers, and then encouraging your peers to walk the same path is really important. It's really a job that requires attention every single day, but also with a constant reminder that this is not just about gender equality. It's placing gender equality in the overall management of what you are running, because, you know, the simple truth is that whatever we do, at the end of the day, we are not going to make it if we don't have both genders participating in the search for a solution to what the problems we're dealing with.
Absolutely. Terrific.